I was just looking for it, but that seems to be the total generalized variation statement sometimes.
Okay, that's true. Okay.
Do you have the reference?
Sure.
Thank you, Chris. That was a really excellent overview. So I'm going to present work from Abafaz Moranian, research associate on my team at King's College London, and this is work that was presented at the Medical Imaging Conference in Atlanta last November, which seeks to solve some of the issues that Chris has raised in that presentation. So perhaps I don't need to dwell too long on the introduction. Obviously, simultaneous PET-MR gives us multi-contrast MR and PET all together simultaneously, or more or less simultaneously. And the assumption is that there is complementarity between the images. They are not completely different, and they're not completely the same, but there are some common features between them, and that's where hopefully we can draw benefit, particularly in the context, as Chris has already pointed out, for undersampled MR, where it becomes more ill-conditioned and needs help. Maybe PET can help there. And when PET gets to very low counts, such as low dose, low injected dose, then MR can really help with the denoising of PET. So there are clearer motivations, but Chris has already, I think, motivated the case for synergistic reconstruction. But as we know, there are some problems, and what Abafaz managed to look at here was coming up with a straightforward, a very simple methodology for synergistic PET-MR, as well as just synergistic MR, a bit like the spectral CT that Chris pointed out. That's an obvious application for synergy. But you can do that in MR, and so Abafaz has nicely done that. So I'll show some of the synergistic MR, where you use T1 to help T2 to help flare and so on, but also synergistic PET-MR. That's one aspect, making a simple methodology, and the other one is dealing with this scaling issue between the images. PET images have one scale, MR images have another scale. How do we handle that? And so what's proposed here does offer a solution. So again, this is recapping what Chris has already looked at. The objective function that we're seeking to optimize is now, of course, still the PET Poisson log likelihood, and now we have MR Gaussian log likelihoods, otherwise known as L2 norms, sort of a least squares problem. And then we have a joint prior. So this is like a penalty term, the U that I was using in the previous talks, which depends on the PET image. So I've used theta, here we're using U, and V1 through to VM correspond to all the different MR images that you might have. That could be a T1, T2, flare, whatever that you have. And the secret is trying to come up with a joint prior to penalize discrepancies. Right, and also to point out that we're using a system model for the PET data. So there's P here, I used A in the previous talks. And for MR, we're using a sort of an overall including matrix E, which includes the undersampling, the discrete Fourier transform, and the coil sensitivity maps for parallel imaging. So you've covered all of that already. So we'll just focus on the joint prior. So the challenges, as touched on already, are that there are different intensities and contrasts between PET and MR, as very clearly seen in those example images, and previous work that Chris has already covered. There does seem to be some issues with regard to robustness to those contrast or intensity differences. And I think they've often scaled the images between 0 and 1 to make them sit within the same kind of scale, same kind of range. But as you can see here, we've got values between 0 and 27,000 here, 1,000 and so on, 6,080. So quite different, and contrast visibly different, of course. So how do we deal with that? And then the other challenge, how do we come up with a practical algorithm that's straightforward to implement? MLEM is straightforward to implement. Hopefully De Piero MapEM is straightforward to implement. I still defend the denominator of MapEM. I don't see an issue with it, but happy to talk about that more later. And so what was proposed was to use MapEM, the De Piero update for PET, because that is robust and, well, okay, to be discussed. very robust method in our experience. And for MR, to use a well-known method there, the conjugate gradient algorithm with a penalized weighted least squares combination. So basically a penalty, a penalized weighted least squares. So using conjugate gradient. So that's bread and butter for MR, bread and butter for PET. Can we put the two together and avoid some of these more demanding algorithms requiring extra hyperparameters, sensitive to initialization, and so on? So those are the two challenges addressed in this work. And so the prior that was proposed is the following. We have what we should be able to recognize as a quadratic penalty for the PET image. So that's looking at a patch in the PET image, looking at neighboring pixel values and saying, well, if they're different, then square the difference, and that gives a penalty for noisy images. But as we know, that's going to smooth legitimate edges, and we want to avoid doing that. Okay, but let me just talk you through how we stop smoothing across legitimate edges just from a PET perspective, without even looking at the MR at the moment. So here's that patch of the PET image. Here's the square difference between every pixel pair in that patch. Then also we have, as I said before, the inverse of the Euclidean distance. So saying the further away these pixels are from each other, the less we're going to penalize them for being different, because obviously you can have meaningful images where you have meaningful differences that are far apart from each other, and that's not due to noise, that's a valid feature that we want to allow. Then we can calculate these weighting factors. Chris showed those, I've briefly touched on them as well before, by using a similarity kernel. So what this does, it just takes the negative of this and uses an exponential. So to cut a long story short, if this is looking confusing, this patch here just gives the similarity of pixel values in this patch. Okay, so if they're similar, you get strong values here, so that's all white along there because these values are similar. There, this is brighter than the center pixel, so therefore this is dark. Okay, so it's a measure of similarity between all the neighboring values and the central pixel value. The idea being, of course, to then activate or deactivate the quadratic penalty according to what we're already seeing in the PET image. And then we can do that simultaneously with the MR image. We can also generate an MR similarity patch. So based on the square difference, Euclidean distance, and then the similarity measure. And then we take the product of the PET similarity with the MR similarity to get an overall combined similarity that allows us, again, to switch on or switch off the quadratic penalty, both for the PET reconstruction and for the MR reconstruction. Any questions on that? You just look at the similarity, and this is done in the algorithm that I'll be describing as you start to iterate. So you start off with a uniform PET image, start off with a uniform MR image, and then find the similarities of all of the different patches in the image for both the MR contrast and the PET contrast, and you'll be multiplying those to get a joint similarity. So there's an edge in any of them, you keep hold of it. That way you can preserve unique features in the PET as well as in the MR. Does that make sense? Yes.
But the pixel size looks the same.
Yes.
Is it?
No. So you have to resample these weights onto a common grid. Okay.
So you take a big patch for MRI then?
So which way around did you? Oh, I said I wouldn't pick on that.
MR is resample, for example.
So you resample the MR to the PET.
The other way around.
Oh, the other way around.
Also, if
You have a choice. Yeah. In fact, it depends on which one you're doing. So for the MR, you resample the PET to the MR. Yeah.
Or all modalities that
Yeah.
you have.
So for the one you're reconstructing, you have to then map the other modalities, the other contrasts to the one that you're. Because of course, multi-contrast MR can have different voxel resolutions as well.
Sure.
So it's just about, okay, for now I'm reconstructing T2 flare or whatever. Okay, I've got to map all my other weighting factors to that sampling. Yeah. Clear?
So how do you deal with the scales in that case?
Sorry?
How do you deal with the scales in that
Right, so the beauty of the scale is dealt with, the scaling issue is dealt with here, that these similarity kernels, these similarity maps, are found by taking the negative of this, then an exponential. So the similarities are forced to be between 0 and 1. Okay, so we keep the V values of the MR contrasts in their own scale, and we keep the U values of the PET image in their own scale. But then we activate or deactivate the penalties on a 0 to 1 sliding range derived from all of the.
the same with the explanation, right?
Yeah, so that omega or the W is exponential minus uj minus ub squared, and then you can choose a weighting factor to see how sensitive you are to differences. You can do a divide.
It's going to be kind of like an H cube.
It's going to be like a.
It's going to get like an H cube, right? Because you have like a difference and an explanation.
It depends. Yeah, you can control it. What you do is you just you can divide this by a sigma squared, which controls the strength and sensitivity to edges for all contrasts. You can use that uniquely. Yeah, but we like parameters, don't we? Yeah.
Okay.
But here they've been conveniently not mentioned, I guess. Sorry. So there are some hidden sigmas there. No, they're set to. Oh, they were there. Where were they? I didn't. Yeah, look, there you go. Omega is a function of the image values and sigma. There we go. It is there. Sorry. Yeah. Great. So that's how to get around the scale differences between the images. And then to get around or rather to seek to have a straightforward algorithm to implement, what's done, and of course this is wide open to investigation. Here the suggestion is do a couple of iterations of good old MLEM. That's what we've all done. That's what I presented earlier. That's that top equation there. It's just the forward projection ratio, back project, multiply that we all know. Regular MLEM update, then regularize using the De Piero method, which can be written in a number of different ways. The one that we gave you earlier is based on the Wang and Chi paper. This one is derived from the original. I don't know, but anyway, this is another rewrite of the same algorithm, basically. It's a solution to a quadratic. So that's the De Piero regularized MapEM, basically. Do that for PET, for 2 iterations. And then we reconstruct the MR images using conjugate gradient, again with a weighted least squares and a penalty. So this is just the familiar normal least squares equations with just that beta penalty built in there. And so what's done here is 2 iterations of conjugate gradient, but of course we could have done 1 or 2 or 3 here, we could have done 1 or 2 or 3 here. And I think where we're tending to go now is to not use conjugate gradient, but to maybe move towards steepest descent to slow it down a bit, because conjugate gradient is pretty downright fast. And as you'll see here, a key feature of this is to slowly build up the similarity maps rather than be locked in very early on with a fixed guidance map, which is what conventional MR guided PET reconstruction would be doing. This tries to avoid the pitfalls of that. So once you've got an update of PET, update of MR, we can then derive the weighting coefficients for the priors for each and every image by taking the product of all the weights for all the images sampled into the contrast or the modality that we're seeking to find the weights for. Clear? So testing that method then, first of all, simulated data. This is the example of FDG, PET, and T1, T2, MR, Cartesian undersampling, factor of 6 for the T1, a factor of 20. So we're really pushing the MR now, as Chris wisely said. If you've got fully sampled MR, then maybe leave well enough alone, no need to interfere. But here we're creating a situation where you've gone to fast MR, so MR is going to need some assistance. And all the details on the different voxel sizes are given for the PET, 2 by 2 by 2, the MR roughly 1 by 1 by 1. Okay, so pointing out the different field of view and different voxel sizes for the different modalities. And then, so we've done simulated data, I'll show you the results in a moment. And then for real data from the MMR, we've got the case of FDG, T1, and flare. Less exciting, so we've got Cartesian undersampling rather than the radial undersampling for the flare. But again, we've got the different voxel sizes, not in between PET and T1, but also between T1 and flare. So you've got tiny voxels for the flare, larger ones for the T1. So the results for the simulated data. This is, first of all, looking only at synergistic MR reconstruction. So that would be analogous to the multispectral CT that was mentioned before. So this is a very obvious application of this, where we don't get into saying that PET is very, very similar or whatever to MR. Here we're saying MR is similar to MR for different contrasts. So here's the fully sampled data for T1, fully sampled data for T2. And you'll notice that we've built in some discrepancies. There's a feature here on the T1, some kind of lesion that's not present on the T2. Likewise, we've got a feature on the T2 not present in the T1. The undersampled reconstructions, no doubt, have artifacts. It's got incomplete data, ill conditioning. This is conventional total variation regularization for the T1 and the T2. Now, the bottom row, this first image here, is where you do the weighted quadratic, where you have a fixed guidance image from the fully sampled T2. So this is like a best case guidance, because we're actually making use of fully sampled data, which we're saying in this instance we don't have, but we're saying let's guide it with the best we can do from T2. And what you'll notice is, because this doesn't have the feature here, notice it's missing, it gets somewhat suppressed in this reconstruction. However, with the proposal of this work, the synergistic reconstruction of T1 and T2 together, where you progressively build up the weighting factors. In other words, you effectively do self-guidance at T1 and self-guidance at T2 simultaneously as the iterations progress. We get to keep that unique feature in the T1 that would have been otherwise suppressed by regular guided reconstruction. And so likewise with the T2, with this feature here, hard to see maybe, but the synergistic does do it better. And so we've got a zoom in here where we can see for this feature here, the synergistic gets very close to the fully sampled case, the reference, and likewise for the T2, we get very close to the reference. Is that all clear? Any clarifications needed? Now looking at the synergistic PET-MR reconstruction, where again we're deliberately pushing it by building in an MR unique lesion that's not present in, this is the ground truth PET, this is the fully sampled MR, and then we've also got a PET unique lesion here, which is not present in that slice of the MR. This is regular MLEM suffering from noise, low count data, so that's our reference. D, in both cases, is the conventional total variation regularization, just an independent reconstruction, standard regularization. So it does the smoothing. And then E is where we are using a fixed guidance image, and we can see the problems creeping in with the reconstruction of the PET data here. By using this guidance, you can see it's isolated this region and separated it out from the rest. And so we've got this kind of artifact arising from a misguidance because it's not actually present in the PET. Whereas if you do the synergistic, you can see that this is looking a lot closer to the ground truth. It doesn't suffer the trap of using a false fixed guidance up front. So the synergistic result really benefiting from this methodology. And then with the PET unique lesion, which is here and not there, you can see, again, the synergistic is nicely keeping hold of that lesion there, whereas This one is being guided by the T1 where the lesion's not present, and so it all gets smoothed out according to the boundaries of the MR. So hopefully that's convincing you that it's doing a much better job in keeping hold of contrast or modality unique features compared to more naive guidance methodologies. Looking at real data now from the MMR, this is synergistic MR reconstruction. So I think it was a factor of 6, factor of 9 undersampling for the flare and the T1, or whichever way around. It was factor of 6, factor of 9. And you can see, I think, looking at the fully sampled reference here, this is what we'd like to have. With undersampled data, we get this. Sorry, the display doesn't do justice to the nice results here. But there are artifacts, as I'm sure you can believe, of undersampled reconstruction, conventional regularization, conventional fixed guidance, and then here we have the synergistic, and Abafaz is nicely zoomed in here so we can see the differences. Here you see the synergistic getting very close to one of these regions here in the T1, where the others have not done very well in reconstructing that region. And likewise for the flare, this one should be close to that compared to the others. And that's quite challenging with real data to really draw out those differences, because sometimes there are not actually that many differences in real data. With simulated, we deliberately challenged it by putting in very different features. And then results for the synergistic PSMR reconstruction. We've got the reference fully sampled data at the top here, conventional reconstructions of the low stats PET and the undersampled MR. And then as we progress with the synergistic reconstructions, you get the kinds of benefits that I've just been talking about earlier, but of course much harder to establish where we don't know what the ground truth is. So you have to go more with the simulation results to know how it's managed to keep hold of unique features. So yeah, I mean, this is with the fixed guidance, and then this is with the progressive build-up of the guidance for each contrast and for the PET. So in conclusion, it's a multimodal, weighted, I'd say progressively weighted quadratic prior. That's the key phrasing here. That's been proposed for synergistic MR as well as synergistic PET-MR reconstruction, which is not so sensitive to the relative signal intensities between PET and MR, or different contrasts of MR and the contrast differences. It's easy to implement using standard methodologies, the MAP-EM, De Piero, and then conjugate gradient, or even steepest descent to slow it down. And then with simulated data, hopefully you'll be fairly convinced it does a much better job than conventional independent reconstruction. Obviously a lot of work to be done here, because what we are doing here is changing the objective function with every update. Those weights are being changed progressively. So it's like we have a moving objective function, which will hopefully slow down and converge to a fixed objective function. And then we have the algorithm moving towards that moving objective. But I think they do slow down to stop, don't they, empirically? Yeah. So thank you. I think that's the last slide. Yeah, just acknowledgements of funding. Any questions? I think the question is, where's dinner or something?
Okay, so I hope you all enjoyed the day. I'm very happy that you're still here. We have -6 minutes left to get to the cocktail, but what we forgot to do is print out the evaluation forms. If you feel like telling us or sending us an email with feedback, that would be very appreciated, how we can improve things for next year or whenever it will be. I hope you learned a lot. You also hope you enjoyed working with the software and trying it yourself. You can get all of that installed on your machines. You can keep the virtual machines. Clearly, watch the project. The software will evolve and improve. And yeah, thank you, and see you for the rest of the conference.